Welcome, everyone. I'm Phil Bell, University of Washington College of Ed, and we're going to sink into our session here in just a second. Thank you so much for making time in your summer to come spend 90 minutes with us and to think about how to work towards equity around diverse sense making. That's our focus for the day today. I have two colleagues that are co-presenting the session with me, so I'm going to let them quickly introduce themselves. Jeannie, do you want to go next?
Yep. Hi, I'm Jeanne Norris. I'm a Learning and Partnership Specialist at UW.
Kathleen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kathleen Arada. I'm a graduate researcher at the University of Washington.
And kind of behind the scenes, helping the whole show go smoothly is Corey Shee. I'll let Corey wave. Corey, do you want to say, there she is. Point of contact for the session. So thanks so much for coming today. We're gonna sink in and get started here. I need to make sure I have the right screen. 1 second. All right, let's try this again. You know how it is with all these multiple monitors and different windows popping up to share. All right, I think I got the right one. So welcome. The three of us are going to open up a 90-minute session. This is, part of a strategy we have underway to really just broadly share the open ed resources that we have to support equitable NGSS and framework implementation in K-12 science ed, and to spend some time building capacity around the resources by actually developing, these sessions, which we're, recording and posting on our site over time so people can get to them asynchronously as they're able. So we will make sure that nobody's face or voice shows up in the recording. So we'll make that pass, but we are trying to capture them and to try to share it more broadly. This particular resource is one that has a bit of a history to it. It was developed originally in partnership with district leadership and teachers within Seattle Public Schools, middle school in particular. We're doing system-wide implementation of NGSS for about 6 years in partnership with that district and Renton School District as a partner. And this resource came out of that effort a little bit towards the end of the effort to try to see how to make sure that we're honoring all the rich intellectual assets that each learner brings to sense making. Social sense making in science ed and in other subjects is incredibly complicated, just given the breadth of human diversity and life experience, and where we're trying to create spaces of belonging and shared collaboration. So we're going to open up a bunch of scenarios that kind of do that work to try to name some of that complexity and help us as educators kind of learn to see those cultural diversities in sense making so that we can leverage them in instruction and create spaces of more deep belonging and shared progress. This resource was then co-designed with Megan Bang, Enrique, Deb, Gina, and Lauren, as you see named here. And then we brought it to our collaborators within the Council of State Science Supervisors, who represent science ed across the country, and co-designed it to be a good fit to educational systems as best we could across the country. So the resource has gone through multiple passes and iterations, and this is just one of 8 different resources that have had this kind of treatment to them. And we'll say more later about how you can get access to all of them, but we're trying to show what it looks like to make use of a resource, encourage you to maybe share them through your networks or adapt them for your local purposes wherever you work. We start by acknowledging the lands on which we reside. So if you go to this particular website, which I'll drop in the chat, you can find the history of Indigenous peoples in an ongoing way to the present moment, wherever you live. It's a pretty fabulous crowdsourced kind of database of those histories. And throughout the session, we'll make some very particular moves to try to support kind of the Indigenous sovereignty pieces of the work, because educational sovereignty certainly is part of recognizing the ongoing histories and futures of tribal nations. I live in Seattle, Washington. University of Washington operates on the lands of people who identify as the Duwamish, Suquamish, Snoqualmie, Puyallup, Muckleshoot, and Tulalip peoples. And we do our work to try to understand those histories and their ongoing endeavors around self-determination. So we try to fold that into our work. So as we get started, I'm going to turn it over to Jeanne to get some frames in place, and then we'll dive in.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to start off with some brief introductions. So in the chat, if you could just please let us know your name, location, and role in science education. So just take a couple of seconds to do that and scan the chat and see who's in the room. Please feel free to meet your needs as they arise during this session. It is 90 minutes, so I understand that's a long chunk of time. So if there's something you need to do during that, please feel free to go do that. And you can access the slides here at this tinyurl.com/accessgpd720. So if you type that in, you'll be able to access the slides. So let's take a second and see who's in the room. Great to see some familiar faces. Hello. All right, great. And as those keep rolling in, I'll just give you an overview. Phil already kind of gave a great introduction to the PD, but just to give you some overall session goals, we are going to be exploring equity dimensions of sense making through the science and engineering practices. We're going to learn to see the different ways that students contribute to making sense of phenomena and connect to science. We'll better appreciate that navigating multiple ways of knowing is a basic human condition, not the exception. And a lot of our resources that we share today are based on work by Megan Bang and others. And we'll make a commitment to shape instruction that supports diverse sense making. So we're not going to develop a product so much as think about building interpretive power of teachers to see student resources and connect them to sense making. So now I'm going to turn it over to Phil.
Oh, thanks. So within this work, we've kind of found over time that it's useful to put some reminders in place just to kind of keep us all calibrated to the endeavor. And I was in a day-long equity session from the National Academy of Sciences Board on Science Ed yesterday, where these reminders were coming up again for me as I was thinking about today's session and their session yesterday. The first is just that teaching is as complex of an endeavor as any other profession, even though a lot of public discourses seem to operate under different assumptions than that. Expertise in teaching continues to develop for decades. I have a colleague who has studied teacher development over 20 to 25 year timeframes. And for ELA and math teachers, teachers keep improving their practice across that time range. And then things start to kind of plateau out in terms of their refined practice. And so I think it's useful for us to just acknowledge where we're at in that endeavor and to kind of understand that it's the ongoing work to kind of keep building our capacities to create kind of equitable, inclusive spaces of belonging and learning. Second reminder is that strategic incremental shifts in your practice with the support and feedback of others that you're in collaboration with is actually the best way to be refining your teaching. So whatever that looks like for you in terms of having cadres of teachers observe each other through lesson study and find their way into new forms, or whether it's your professional learning community doing some version of collaborative of learning and preparation for instruction and refinement. Encourage you to kind of keep being experimental and collaborative in that way, because we know like strong incremental shifts in that strategic way are kind of what leads to change. And we'll actually end today's session by having you try to kind of name some of those specific shifts that you want to make in your practice to bring back to your collaboratives. The third point is really underneath all of it, which is that promoting uniformity in instruction, curriculum, and assessment is in direct tension with what we know about human cultural diversity and learning and geographic specificity and histories of place. And so although it's useful to have a shared kind of set of pieces to be thinking together with, we know we have to build capacity to attend to local and kind of historied differences within the particular communities in which we serve our community. So in that sense, like uniformity can be a good starting place, but we must find our way through cultural diversity as our deeper focus within the work. So with those reminders in place, we're going to find our way kind of into the details. We've been working for the past, I'd say 2.5 years around a framework for equity projects in K-12 science ed. It's kind of represented through this kind of flower diagram that we've published a year ago, May, naming these different equity projects that are actionable at the instructional level, from disrupting ableism, taking up place-based learning, ecological caring practices within the classroom, centering racial justice and Indigenous self-determination, meaningful phenomena being centered around curricular experiences, multi-generational learning being opened up with community and across grade bands, cultural pedagogies shaping instruction in relation to the lifeways that reside within the communities you serve and where those communities are evolving. And then today's focus, supporting diverse sense making, which we're going to sink into details around over the next 90 minutes. It is a kind of an intersecting flower diagram on purpose, because a particular equity project very quickly starts to intersect with the others in very specific ways. And so we have a set of resources that we've been building with our collaborators in the Council of State Science Supervisors that we're kind of publishing to kind of provide professional learning pathways, both within each project, but in intersectional ways as well. So today we are dialing into the science and engineering practices specifically, one of the three dimensions of the NRC standards and NGSS standards. So this diagram is probably my favorite diagram of the practices. It kind of names the 8 and highlights a very dynamic image of how different lines of pursuit shown in the center might bring individuals or small groups or classes between different aspects of the practices across instruction. And I think for those of you familiar with the resources that have been developed since this diagram came out a while back, you'll see a lot of this represented in instructional materials that are aligned to the framework and NGSS vision that gives us a rich way of bringing students into the practices of engaging in science and engineering. Today's task is then to think about the cultural diversities around how those practices get constituted and kind of brought to life in classroom spaces. So that's all the scenarios we'll be thinking in today, kind of intersect with these practices as it relates to cultural diversities that we'll be naming. So there's a very well-known piece that NSTA has made publicly available that's referenced here from Megan Bang, Brian Brown, Angie Calabrese-Barton, Ann Roseberry, and Beth Warren. That equity chapter that's in the practices book, I wish it was like kind of just one of those required pieces of reading that all of K-12 science ed would read together and make sense of together. It has so many powerful pieces to it. They frame the problem and the potential of the practices in this way. Realizing the potential of the practices is particularly important in relation to students of color, students who speak first languages other than English, and students from low-income communities who, despite numerous waves of reform, have had limited access to high-quality, meaningful opportunities to learn science. So we're turning into the inequities that are built into systems of science education, and then trying to see how the practices in particular give us a platform to create more equitable learning opportunities for youth that historically have been marginalized through kind of science ed specifically. They go on to kind of put a frame around learning in place, and this is kind of in their own words, but it directly connects back to all science learning being cultural. That's framed in the NRC framework and the How People Learn Volume 2 that the National Academy has published. And so just to get this image of culture on the table, I'm going to read their definition. Human beings, no matter who we are, where we live, or what languages we speak at home, develop our ways of knowing, talking, valuing, and acting as we live our day-to-day lives inside family and community. These ways of living are what is now understood as culture. Indeed, across communities, human beings make sense of the world in ways that are both similar and different. And it's that complexity of similar and different that we're holding across the 8 science and engineering practices as we sink into the scenarios today. So it's a cultural variation kind of stance that we want to be holding on to. All right, so we're going to ask you to reflect a bit on the expertise you're bringing into the space, both individually and as a teacher. And so maybe we're just going to stop and pause for a couple of minutes and have people through the chat describe what does it look like when students make sense of phenomena. And you may choose a very core image of that, or you might choose kind of a more unique but important version of that. And share that, just describe it in a sentence or two so that we can kind of see the ideas that we're all bringing to the endeavor today. If you'd rather, you can also think about your own sense-making process around phenomena of the world or universe and describe that instead. So either students you work with or either yourself. So let's stop and pause and just wait for a couple of minutes to see what we have as a community to work with. All right, leveraging prior knowledge, connecting emerging understandings, the thing they've heard before, social processes of connecting ideas and making them public and finding connections between them. Asking questions and actively searching for answers. A lot of images of driving question boards on Twitter over the past year. Flash to mind, as you say that. Questions deepening as they find their way further into inquiry. That it looks messy, but they get chances to engage in different practices, allows them to build and refine that understanding. Noticing, wondering, and making connections. Fabulous. All right. Well, I encourage you to kind of look through that list of wisdom that people are sharing and to hold on to it as we get into particular examples that might directly, connect to those ideas or expand upon them. So thank you for lifting up those pieces. We, within our resource development work, hold equity and justice priorities core to what we do, and have developed that over the past 8 years or so when we've been doing the work. This particular quote, which comes from a faculty colleague of mine whose interests are being served, is one of our guiding reminders, because it kind of calls the question of how are we choosing based on what criteria and for whom are choices made in the work that we do. And that can be in all sorts of ways in terms of how curriculum get adopted, which ones for, who do they work well with, what supports, where do resources go around professional learning, flashing to discussions of PK5 in particular, and where resources don't go for professional learning. And for today's session, we're going to stop and really think about those in the moment decisions that we all make as we are members of a learning community engaged in sense making. Whose interests are being served by the choices that we're we're individually and collectively making about stopping to, deeply hear a contribution from an individual, or stopping to like make time for a messy process of like figuring something out as a collaborative. So as we kind of go through the scenarios, we encourage you to kind of hold this stance around whose interests are being served through the decisions and the kind of ways in which we make choices of doing that path versus another path. If we had a little bit more time, we would sink in. So we're doing this in a full session. We would stop and read this particular STEM teaching tool. These are one-page briefs for the most part that try to serve as idea and resource funnels around problems and opportunities of educational practice. This particular resource, number 47, is around equitable sense making. And it is a collaborative resource developed by scientists and science ed researchers and teachers. And the whole motivation behind the piece is that they were concerned by what they saw as artificial attempts to go to consensus within a community around, an explanation or model for a phenomena, when in fact, an important norm of scientific community is to keep different ideas in play until there's a compelling reason to like think otherwise. And so they wanted to deeply turn into this idea that based on our histories and the knowledge we bring and the values we bring, different perspectives should be centered in sense making until we come to a collective decision to move forward in a particular consensus driven way. And so if you have time, encourage you to kind of sink into the full resource, and they link off to other supporting resources and pieces, but it certainly mirrors the stance that we're trying to hold today around sense making. Is like, how do we really deeply understand that the different multiple perspectives, the different cultural ways of knowing that are in play in the community that we're working within. The main takeaway, going back to the chapter quickly, and then we're going to get into an activity here, is that creating equitable learning opportunities depends critically on teacher skill in seeing and hearing students' ideas and reasoning as connected to science, as opposed to being off topic or worse, disruptive. And so as a stance, even though we as an educator may not see the connection that a student is trying to make by them entering into a conversation to add a perspective, it's kind of on us and on the whole community to try to figure out like, what is the connection that they're searching for in that moment? And can we deeply hear that and center that in our shared sense making? So it's a tough thing because it goes against pacing guides and all sorts of criteria for moving along in a curriculum. And yet creating those equitable learning experiences requires us to stop and pause in this way to deeply see the contributions of others. And so Jeanne used this term early on, interpretive power. We'll like formally define that at the end of today, but it's like, how do we learn to see those contributions as intellectual resources to like deeply understand, even if we don't understand them when they're first put on the table. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Jeanne, who's gonna take us into an activity.
All right, can everybody see my screen? My screen shifted a little bit, but we're good to go. Okay, threw me for a loop there. All right, so we're going to shift gears a little bit and play an interactive game to practice seeing those sense-making resources of other people. So this is a game of conceptual charades. Some of you might not have played charades before. So here are the ground rules. You'll be in a group, and one person will be trying to get the rest of you to guess a specific concept. So the one ground rule is that the hint giver cannot speak or write in English. You may not speak or write in English, okay? Anything else, literally anything else, is fair game, okay? So we will go into breakout rooms, and you're going to be in a breakout room of about 4 or 5. And you're going to introduce yourselves to each other, your name, your state, and your role in science education, just to get a sense of who's in the room. And you need to pick one person in each group to be the hint giver. So please decide this quickly, like in less than a minute, if you can. Okay, just be brave and volunteer. Okay, so once you decide who the hint giver is, send them back into the main room to us to receive 3 words or phrases from us. And so the hint giver is going to need probably like a piece of paper, or you're going to need to type these words somewhere. Okay. Once you decide who, so you're going to go back into your room and you're going to act out each concept for 2 minutes per word or phrase. So be looking for the breakout room messages that show across the top of your screen, and we'll help you keep track of time. Okay. So I think we have the breakout rooms set up. We good to go? Okay. Any questions before we send you into the breakout room? Again, introduce yourselves, and then within 1 minute, pick one person and send them back to us to go get the 3 words or phrases. Okay. And no speaking or writing in English when you give your clues. Okay. All right. So let's see how this works.
So I think we have everyone, and I think we should, yeah, just get the 3 concepts on the table.
Okay.
And so, yeah, it's really just the 3 concepts. So we'll come do the other rule stuff on the slides later. So, okay, Jeanne.
Okay. So here are your 3 words. Word number 1 is rotation. Rotation. Word number 2 is, or phrase number 2 is gravitational pull. Gravitational pull. And phrase number 3 is curved space. Okay, so I hope that was really fun and interesting for you. Yes, I love the shout outs to the teamwork. So now we're going to just kind of debrief how that went. So hopefully you enjoyed the space theme with the new J West telescope photos. So how did charades go for you? Let's just share out initial thoughts of how it was going. Were you able to guess it? How did you do it? Thanking your hint giver, your fearless hint giver. So did anyone use the standard charade signals to be successful, like indicating the number of words or syllables, like, you know, like this or this, or?
Yeah, looks like we had a couple, we had a few.
Awesome. Number of words, yeah. Okay. So if you did the signals, did that help you finish more quickly? Do you think that was something that added to your success? Yeah. Yeah. So that was like a cultural assumption that you were taking advantage of right there. Okay. So everybody had to understand that that was the rule. Okay. What cultural, so let's, in the chat, we can just share, what cultural assumptions do you think that students bring to the classroom that give some of them an advantage over others in classroom conversations? Can you just share in the chat maybe some cultural assumptions that students are using? Yeah, so we had to assume that everyone knew the rules of charades, definitely. Yeah, thanks, Corey. What are some cultural assumptions that students might be using in your classrooms? Right, so language, speaking a particular language, how to participate in school, gestures mean the same thing in all cultures. Most conversations looking for the right answer as quickly as possible, definitely. Terms in all languages mean the same, giving information, teachers giving information. So did anybody use a different language to communicate with their group? You were only told not to use English. So did you think to use a different language? Were you able to use a different language? Anybody? You tried. Okay. Facial expressions. Yeah. One facilitator used American Sign Language. That's amazing. Okay, cool. Sign language was discussed afterwards. Okay. Yeah. So what other communication resources do you have besides language? What types of things did you use? And did your strategies change over time? So gestures, drawing, images. Oh, Igpe Atenlay. Wow. Okay. All right. I was not expecting that one. Okay. Whole body acting out. All right. Did anybody's strategies change over time at all, or were you just going with your strategy that you had initially used? Maybe the same. Okay. So as teachers, what assumptions are we making about how our students communicate and interpret information? And how can this activity start to help us notice the diverse sense-making skills that students bring into our classroom? Come in not knowing the new material, but they use prior knowledge to help them. We're assuming that they can read and write in English. Absolutely. Yeah. So, in order for people to communicate ideas in a non-standard way, we are using gestures, body language, objects, maybe multiple languages, and just the rules of charade communication. So hopefully we are starting to see, that it's not just about these very standard ways of communication that we often see in school. And we'll give some examples later that dive deeper into that. So now I'm going to pass it over to Kathleen. And Kathleen, are you cool with me just advancing your slides?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
All right, cool.
Yeah, so now we're going to go just a little bit deeper into the dimensions of equity and justice in the context of science teaching. So connecting back to the science and engineering practices, learners are really able to make sense of phenomena. From the equity chapter in the framework. If you just click one more time, Jeanne, please. Yeah, thanks. Curriculum and assessment often promote very narrow views of what counts as desired ways of speaking, knowing, acting, and valuing. We need to broaden what counts as learners make sense of phenomena, especially for multilingual students, students of color, and students from low-income communities. So in instruction, thanks. We need to work to keep the practices broadly inclusive to the cultural variation in our learning community. A practice like modeling can be really powerful, especially for historically marginalized and underrepresented students, to show what they know and how they can connect, like how they're representing systems, its relationships and its dynamics, and doing it through their lenses. This should really be a process of getting students to relate and reveal and refine their ways of knowing. Next slide, please. Yeah, so these are the 3 equity principles from the equity chapter in the NSTA practices book. They're a really powerful set of general principles for more equitable and expansive teaching. Principle 1, noticing sense-making repertoires. So considering students' diverse sense-making and the different ways which they connect to phenomena and how this relates to science practices. Principle 2, supporting sense-making, encouraging students to use their cultural sense-making repertoires and experiences and leveraging them as important and valuable tools to engage with science practices. Principle 3, engaging in diverse sense-making. So acknowledging that students' science practices and knowledges continue to develop and change, and that their community histories, values, and practices contribute to scientific understanding and problem solving. But today we're really going to focus in on principle 1. Right now, we're going to explore a specific case. We're going to just take a few minutes to read through STEM teaching tool number 11, implementing meaningful STEM education with Indigenous students and families. So as you read this, think about what are some of the cultural sense-making resources of Indigenous students and families that relate to the science practices. And we're going to share them in the chat later. could just take a few minutes to read through that tool, and we'll talk about them in a bit. Okay, I know that was really not enough time to sink in, but I invite you to return back to it after the session. I wonder if we could just take a minute and write quickly in the chat, type quickly in the chat, what were some of the cultural sense-making resources of Indigenous students and families that relate to the science practices? Yeah, so what were some of the cultural sense-making resources of Indigenous students and families that relate to the science practices? So we see that personal observation of the land, observation and storytelling. Great, yeah, so when they're observing animals, plants, and weather patterns over time, place-based knowledge of ecosystems, looking for patterns, great. Cool. So yeah, again, I invite you to read that a little bit more deeply later. Next slide. Sorry.
Hang on one second. I don't.
Yeah. Jeanne.
Sorry. Are we on the right side?
That's good. Thank you.
Sorry.
That's all right. I thought it was my technical difficulties too. So, as we think about instruction, we also need to think about assessment and how we're approaching it in ways that really invite and honor students' diverse sense-making resources. And, we don't have time to dive into this today, but STEM teaching tool number 16 really goes into a framework for conversation-based assessment, and it closely relates to what we're going to be doing a little bit. It's a great resource to look through after activities today. So assessment is often talked about as an instrumental practice focused on monitoring learning or motivating educational achievement. We really need to talk with students about understanding why we need to do formative assessment through our words and through our actions, how we talk about sense making. Assessment can be part of the process of developing a trusting relationship with your students. It can be an act of caring, a practice of caring. So it's a way to focus instruction on learner voice, knowledge, perspective, and contribution. So in this process, this caring stance can support building crucial intellectual relationships with students.
Okay, so now we're going to take a look at a few different scenarios or situations of learning. And this is our guiding question for these scenarios. And we'll put it in the chat as well. Thank you so much for keeping on that, Corey. What are the sense-making resources that learners are showing evidence of in each of the following learning scenarios? So we're looking for their sense-making resources that they are bringing to the table. And so I'm going to start with Phil is going to give us an example that he knows very well. So I'm going to turn it over to him.
Yeah, thanks, Jeanne. So I kind of really want you to kind of channel the STEM teaching tool on Indigenous ways of knowing that we just read, as well as you think about this particular scenario. So this was all the scenarios are based in kind of either very particular teacher histories or in the research literature. So these are, authentic examples in that sense. So I'm going to read this particular scenario, and then we'll go into breakout rooms with our collaborators to think through kind of what are the intellectual resources that you see telegraphed in the scenario. So, all right, it's called the saltwater plant experiment. An elementary school girl in Hawaii participated in a science fair and entered her science experiment on the conditions needed to support plant growth. As the result of climate change, ocean salt water is intruding into areas where native crops are grown in her community. She did a controlled comparison showing how taro plants respond to different concentrations of salt water. She received a low score from judges because she used a small number of taro plant samples. However, Taro plants are sacred to her as ancestors and living relations of her native Hawaiian cultural community. So she tried to minimize the number of taro plants that would be injured in her science experiment. She thought the sample size was adequate. So you're going to have you in your breakout rooms reflect on what are the sense-making resources that you see evidence of here. And just to kind of seed the space a little bit, if you want one more extra hint, I'll ask, Jeanne, just show that phrase at the bottom. If you don't want the hint, you don't have to look at the yellow pop-up. And with that, we're going to pop back into our breakout rooms and have discussions. So what are the sense-making resources that learners are showing evidence of in the scenario? And Kathleen, let's open up breakout rooms. You have like 3 to 4 minutes, so we'll let you know. All right, that was the first scenario. We're going to try to get through 4 more. So, okay, in chat, maybe just summarize a bit of, name the intellectual resources that you saw the young person using in their science fair experiment. So let's just stop and pause for 20 to 30 seconds to let people name what resources you saw. Understanding our culture's effort to conserve, where they come, cultural knowledge of tarot, cultural practices of STEM work. Yeah, fabulous. Well, it looks like you had good conversations. So Jeanne, go ahead and build out the slide. So here's our sense of the resources, to kind of name them, which I think mirror a lot of what's in chat. So she evidenced knowledge of local impacts of climate change and ecological reasoning, so worried about taro plants with rising sea level. She planned and conducted an ethical investigation, and I think that ethical word should be underlined, right? So she's worried about harming her relations, right? So like she's invoking kind of an ethical priority in kind of the construction of the investigation. And then the third one is that she's very much expressing a human nature relationship between plants and animal, persons that live in that setting. And so I use the word persons very intentionally. This is very much an indigenous ontology, it's called. It's like a worldview, world sense, where humans and plants and animals generally are in relation to each other and are relatives. And so you can think about, you wouldn't want to harm your uncle in an investigation, so we are not going to harm this taro plant in an investigation, right? So it's kind of like at that level of care. Pedagogical implications, like, very much her concerns are rooted in her cultural value system, which I saw people naming in the chat and should be respected. Understanding trade-offs in what you can claim about, patterns that you see in data, but like that obviously is something that we should be caring for as a ethical, way that she's proceeding. And that instruction should be open to the multiple scientific ways of knowing that we see in place here. And she's leveraging other knowledge systems of that place and from her community to make sense of what she's doing. So that's the summary of the first one, and we're going to move on to the next one. I'm going to hand it over to Jeanne to open up the second scenario.
Okay, and I chose this one because it reminded me of my students, because this is exactly what happened in class. And so it was fun to see it on the slide and know that that's really how it happens. So 6th grade students are studying plate tectonics using a data visualization tool. As students work to make sense of key concepts, subduction, rift, and buckling, they use their hands to express their developing conceptual models before they're able to describe them in speech. once the models appear in speech and gesture used together, figured prominently in the further elaboration, modification, and refinement of the concepts. Students often compared and negotiated their understanding with their hands. Okay, so that is the scenario. Does anybody need any clarification? And I won't sing this song to you, but my students used this song to the tune of the Addams Family, and I wasn't sold on it, but the teachers were like, do it, they love it, they love it. And we did it, and it's like, converging is colliding, diverging is dividing, transform is sliding, they are the plate boundaries. I did sing anyways, I'm so sorry, my apologies to Ted Willard also. So, but yeah, I mean, it was so much fun when they did that. So we are going to look for their sense-making resources and be ready to share again in the chat what you identify. So we're going to go back to the breakout rooms and talk about the plate tectonic scenario for 3 minutes.
All right. What resources were students using?
All right, so I hear student voice and choice, collaboration, performance-based multimodalities, using bodily kinesthetic learning to create a model, communicating info in a creative way, speech, gesture, comparison, elaboration, and negotiation. Yeah, so that's matching up with a lot of what we're going to see on the slide here as well. So gestural modeling and revision. Using gestures first and then with speech, and modeling and sense making through talk. So definitely bringing a lot to the table there. And in terms of pedagogical implications, you can just click a little bit. Yeah. So are there phenomena or models that you can think of that lend themselves more to gesture? You can maybe share those in the chat and just think about, are some students more practiced than others in this sort of thing?
Yeah.
Yes, we see engaging in argument using evidence is also there for sure. Yeah.
So I was on Twitter, and yesterday I saw that the International Society of Gesture Studies was meeting in Chicago, and there were a lot of education people there studying, learning, and kind of just how gesture is integrated with learning and teaching. So it is like this whole subfield, and the one finding I can share is that often our gestures come together in correct ways before we can put words on top of the explanation. So it's actually an interesting, just phenomena of how we make sense of the world is often through gestures when they lend themselves. So, all right, we're going to move on to the next one because time is clicking away. And Kathleen, do you want to put this one on the table and I'll get ready to show it?
You'll have to share the gesture event too. I'm just looking that up right now. But right now we are going to watch a video together looking at how a student uses hip hop to explain science concepts.
Drop that, sound guy. I'm about to tell y'all a little something about work and kinetic energy, all right? So clap your hands for me, please. Check. Yo, yeah, this concept is applied to all lives. We stride times distance, be a witness to the prize. Be a man, understand you comprehending this is vital. Work equals FD, the equation for survival. Your only rival is friction, don't get caught up in the drag. You better prepare, cause obstacles fight back. When you get knocked down, no, please don't cry. Just get up and apply more force next time. One day, I was dreaming with a really strong hope that I'll make it, but to make it takes more than just believing. These resistance/demons were kinda holding me back, and I let them, but the simple way to get me on track was force times displace is work, no debate. I'll take that concept, apply it to my mistakes, and now I'm progressing a natural rap genius. I'ma get an A if I see this on the regen. Here's a lesson, I know it kinda hurts, but if you truly wanna work, then there must be progression, cause FD equals W the rule, and the unit measurement for the product is called joules. Cool.
Okay, it goes on, and I encourage you to watch the full video, but in the interest of time, Kathleen's going to put you into breakout rooms and we'll go for 3 minutes and we'll come back. What resources do you see? All right, well, hopefully that was a fun discussion, and Kathleen, I guess I'll hand it back to you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. So why don't you take a moment to just type out in the chat maybe some of the resources that you saw that the student was using. So just take a minute to do that, type that in the chat, and we'll share some other things that we saw too. Bringing cultural language and dialect, using rhythm and rhyme, expression through music. Yeah, so for those of you that didn't know, this is to the tune of Kick Push from Lupe Fiasco. So, the student is communicating through music. You can press the slides. Sorry, it's Phil. Thank you. Yeah, so communicating through music, combining the lyrics and the rhythm and the flow, integrating, conceptual science ideas, sharing connections from his personal life. Great. Yeah, expression through music. And then the pedagogical implications. Take a moment, what science learning might be involved with communication performances? How might this support science identity development? We can think more about this later, just given time. So
yeah. Yeah, Chris Emden has been doing this work, I think, for over a decade. There's a very active hip hop ed Twitter community that meets multiple times per week. University of Wisconsin-Madison actually runs a hip hop teacher ed program that often convenes in the summer. So there's a whole community that engages in this work. So I encourage you to sneak in more. We're going to try to sneak in one last scenario, and we're going to stay in the room here to make sense of it together. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeanne.
All right. So again, I asked to present this scenario just because so many of my students love video games. My own son loves video games. So here it is. So it's several days before Steve's 10th birthday, and his family will be throwing a LAN party for him, his friends, and other family friends where they will play his favorite multiplayer video game against each other. Steve is poring over the player profiles and analytics of the people coming to the party, which are represented through various graphs and statistics. So Steve's going real hard here. He spends hours analyzing their game time preferences and stats while developing strategies for how he can beat them during the party. That literally sounds like what my son would try to do. So, all right, so let's see. What do we think? What sorts of cultural sense-making resources is Steve bringing to the science table? And you can just share in the chat. For my son and for my students, like Minecraft was a big deal, Roblox, very big deal. Getting to know his audience, analyzing and interpreting data analysis, awesome. Yeah, so let's go ahead and advance the slide. And again, you're right on the money about this fluency with data. So he's bringing, time series data analysis, probabilistic reasoning about data trends, predictive modeling with strategic planning. So lots of things, like really complex thinking that Steve is doing here. To figure out how to win his video game. So many youth deeply engage in video gaming with sustained design, analysis, sustained problem solving, and programming. So has anybody used that type of expertise? Has anybody leveraged that in the classroom with students successfully? Maybe you can share in the chat. Yeah, 10 years old. Yeah, and I think that Phil knows this example.
Yeah, this came from an ethnography we were doing in Seattle. He started in front of the computer when he was 6 months old, actually. So he had colic and he'd wake up in the middle of the night and they'd sit in front of the computer until he calmed back down and went to sleep. He's like the most tech savvy. And now, of course, he's like 22 because this was a while back. But he was quite the expert in video gaming. He could beat the creators of the game who actually live in Seattle. He was that expert at 10 to 12.
Can you go to slide 54 for me next, Phil?
Yeah, so we're going to go wrap up. Just to say, there are like 8 more scenarios in the slide deck, which we'll be sharing. So we've looked at 5, but like there's a bunch of others. And we encourage you, I was just talking to my colleagues in Louisiana Department of Ed, and they took this resource and adapted it to a bunch of their own local examples that they use with teachers. So like really encourage you to kind of think about other scenarios that highlight diverse sense making.
So just to reflect quickly, there are many resources that students bring to bear, stories and experiences. Humor is a big one. There's a paper, and I don't know if it's freely available, maybe Phil can share it, about interpretive power. Think about, again, pausing when students are, participating in your classroom and maybe not making assumptions about what they're trying to do when they make that participation. So like there's a story of a student who saw something, strange with beans growing without soil. And he says, did you put magic beans in there or something? And I just love that so much because it's so easy to just like roll your eyes and be like, okay, thanks, moving on, to that student. But he was meaning something when he said that. So really tuning into those comments that students make, I think is really important. Oh, actually, that's from chapter 3 again, of helping students make sense of the world. So do check out
that. We'll share it in just a second.
Yeah. So, again, building artifacts, crafting media, having sensory feelings that they associate. So, how else do your students spend their time making sense of the world? I just really encourage you to keep reflecting on that. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide.
You're there.
Oh, sorry. Yep. Okay. So now we're going to just think about how we can make a plan to develop our interpretive power. So I'm going to read this quote about that by educational researchers Ann Roseberry, Beth Warren, Eli Tucker Raymond, this concept of interpretive power. This refers to teachers' attunement to students' diverse sense-making repertoires as intellectually generative in science, and B, expansive pedagogical practices that encourage, make visible, and intentionally build on students' ideas, experiences, and perspectives on scientific phenomena. So again, this just thinking about building your interpretive power. And this is, again, we're taking this through a cultural lens, and there are different approaches to culture-based pedagogy. So there's culturally relevant and responsive, which you probably have heard of, culturally sustaining that are popular, but there's also culturally resurgent. So we are trying to meaningfully connect to the cultural lives of youth and their communities, their languages, literacy, knowledge, and practices. And it can also be a context for supporting the resurgence of the lifeways of cultural communities by valuing and centering the languages, literacy, knowledge, practices, and worldviews of cultural communities. Culturally resurgent pedagogy promotes cultural pluralism in society and promotes the rights of non-dominant communities. Again, thinking back to, the saltwater plant experiment, the indigenous STEM teaching tool that we read. Next slide, please. So in terms of the stance that you can adopt, it's just a generous and open one to what students produce, developing a norm for the messiness that a lot of you mentioned in the chat when you were talking about what sense making looks like, and ambiguity that comes with sorting out complex new ideas. So again, how can you do this? How can you cultivate that classroom learning community where everyone's welcome to contribute? It may start with just listening closely and opening up one student's thinking deeply. So don't always popcorn quickly around the room. And so, once you start to do this, again, you're going to be centering multiple ways of knowing and really leveraging those multiple ways in order to make progress on scientific investigations. And so again, just to remind you of a major takeaway, we can work to have all these different kinds of sense-making resources connected to science in meaningful ways to build relationships with each other and to science. So again, the bottom line is the more you show genuine intellectual and scientific interest in your students' sense-making of phenomena, the more you expand the space of possible relations among you, your students, and science. Again, from that Chapter 3 of Helping Students Make Sense of the World by Bang, Brown, Calabrese, Barton, Roseberry, and Warren. And that's really, it's really that simple. And I like that quote too. It's just a bottom line of just being open and genuine with your students and curious about what they're thinking. So next slide, we can take an equity stance, and think about in terms of belonging, recognizing and legitimizing the ways of knowing that learners bring to make sense of phenomena. In terms of desettling, disrupting narrow ways of speaking, knowing, acting, and valuing when making sense of phenomena. So again, getting away from just those known answer questions and strict turn taking, and extending cultural learning pathways by leveraging the sense-making resources of youth to help them develop a relationship to science and better identify with the endeavor and promote their sense of belonging. Again, so it's belonging, desettling, and extending these cultural learning pathways. So I think for the sake of time, we might, if you want to visit that Jamboard later, you are welcome to, but if you wanted to just put in the chat one takeaway related to how you can respond to student contributions, did I jump in? Or what you'll commit to trying out in your practice to shift deeper into an asset-based view of sense making. So again, if you want to visit that Jamboard later, you can. I think for now, we can just, if you want to put a takeaway for you in the chat, I would love to see it. And I know we're a little bit over time, so I do want to respect your time if you have to leave, but if you can stick around, we'd really appreciate it. We just got a couple more things to share with you.
I wonder if we should move on to resources. Yeah. Should we do?
Yeah, so if you could, we're going to put this tiny URL in the chat. This is a Google form survey. I would really appreciate it if you would give us some feedback about how to refine the activities. We really do appreciate that as we are growing our PD offerings over time. I would love to hear what you think about what you've experienced. So I'll just put that in the chat really quick.
And as we go to close, just to kind of highlight, so we've been building kind of this open collection of STEM teaching tools for almost 8 years now, and we have a bunch of these PD modules available, and soon to have 89 briefs that on different topics related to equitable and GSS framework instruction. So please, my one-liner joke is like, these are your resources because you've already paid for them with your taxpayer dollars. So like these are kind of funded through the National Science Foundation. So we encourage you to kind of, leverage the whole collection and make use of it through your networks in ways that make sense. We try to have each resource be a funnel for what are the best ideas and tools related to that particular topic. So I encourage you to dive in more deeply. We're very active on Twitter. So if you go to STEM Teach Tools, you can find daily things that are shared there on Twitter. And if you're not on Twitter, I'd encourage you to use it as a professional learning network. A lot of folks here are in that space. And we do have a newsletter if you'd rather get a low volume, just update about new resources. We send out every 2 to 3 months, just like the batch of new stuff. So you can sign up for the free newsletter, and we don't share the email address with anyone else. I think that's it. There's other resources in the slide deck from our colleagues, and so I'll let you explore those as you have time. There are so many people who provided feedback on this particular resource, so gratitude to everyone who helped create this powerful resource. It's really a fun one to be opening up with colleagues, and so encourage you to kind of find your way kind of into it. And I think with that, I'm gonna stop and pause and thank Jeanne and Kathleen for co-presenting, and thank you all for coming today. And I hope you have a glorious remainder of the summer. And can regenerate a bit as we kind of find our way back towards the fall. So take good care, everyone. Thanks for coming. And we'll hang out here if you want to chat, but we also know you may want to find your way to your next thing. So take care.
Thanks, everyone.